Hey guys, it's me Seren, back with another video. Today is February 8th, and so we are on our 8th hidden figure, who is Anne Bethel Spencer, who was born February 6th, 1882, and died July 27th, 1975. Anne Spencer was an American poet, teacher, civil rights activist, librarian, and gardener. Spencer fought against racial discrimination and in 1913 helped establish a Lynchburg, Virginia branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. In 1924, she became the first Black American librarian in Virginia when she became librarian at Dunbar High School. Later in life, she also became an acclaimed poet and member of the Harlem Renaissance, influencing many of the Black American writers and artists of that time, including W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, and Paul Robeson. More than 30 of her poems were published in her lifetime, making her an important figure of the Black literary and cultural movement of the 1920s, and one of 3 Black American women included in the highly influential Norton Anthology of Modern Poetry. The Spencer's home was an important center and intellectual saloon for guests and dignitaries such as Marian Anderson, George Washington Carver, Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King Jr., and James Weldon Johnson. Annie Bethel Bannister was born in Henry County, Virginia, to Joel Bannister and Sarah Louise Scales, Black Americans who were determined to make a better life for their daughter. Though her father Joel was born a slave in 1862, her mother was born free, and both parents were part of the first generation of Black Americans whose childhood followed the demise of slavery. As an only child, she was the center of her parents' affections, yet the two separated over differences in ideas about child rearing. After the separation, Annie Bannister was then known as Annie Scales, taking her mother's maiden name. Mother and daughter moved to West Virginia and settled in Bramwell, a town whose acceptance of Black Americans and immigrants was unusual for the time. Annie lodged in the home of the Dixie family while her mother lived and worked as a cook at a local inn. The Dixies included William T. Dixie, an owner of his own barbershop, his wife Willie Bell, and their 5 children. They were prominent members of the Black American community. Naturally bright, Anne was homeschooled as her mother Sarah believed the colored schools in the area were unsuitable for her daughter. Sarah also insisted that Anne would not work or do chores in the Dixie household, leaving her with an unusual amount of freedom for a Black American child in the late 19th, early 20th century. As such, Anne often explored her surroundings alone, acquiring a deep appreciation for nature, solitude, and the countryside of Bramwell. She would also often take a catalog into the Dixie family outhouse and seclude herself there, turning the pages and imagining herself as a writer. Despite their separation, her parents remained in contact about her well-being and actively co-parented her. When her father learned she was not getting a formal education and was illiterate, he insisted she attend school or he would take her back to live with him. And so in 1893, at the age of 11, Anne was enrolled in Virginia Seminary and Normal School in Lynchburg, Virginia. Although she couldn't read at the time of enrollment, Anne excelled in a formal school setting, quickly learning to read by devouring dime store novels and newspapers. She was named valedictorian when she graduated in 1899 at 17. While at Virginia Seminary, Anne became interested in poetry and she wrote her first poem, The Skeptic. She would continue to write poetry throughout school using any scrap of paper or catalog page that was handy to record her thoughts. Her poems were often about race and nature. For example, her most famous poem, entitled White Things, is a comparison of the subjugation of the Black race to the destruction of nature. White Race has been called the quintessential protest poem. Annie returned to Bramwell after graduation and taught school in West Virginia from 1899 to 1901. While at the Virginia Seminary, Annie met fellow student Charles Edward Spencer, whom she married on May 15, 1901 at the Dixie home in Bramwell. In 1903, the Spencers moved permanently to Lynchburg, Virginia, and built a home at 1313 Pierce Street where they raised 3 children together. An avid gardener, Spencer's home at Pierce Street also included a huge garden and one-room garden house where she did most of her writing. Inspired by her time growing up in nature in Bramwell, much of her poetry was deeply connected to her garden, and the plants she grew there were used symbolically, especially as metaphors for race, in many of her poems. In 1919, she began to organize opening a Lynchburg chapter of the NAACP and hosted novelist James Weldon Johnson in her home as a traveling representative. Johnson discovered Anne's poetry, and working through his own editor, Anne had her first poem, Before the Feast at Shushan, published in the February 1920 issue of The Crisis, the magazine of the NAACP. She was 40 years old when Before the Feast at Shushan was published. After publication, Spencer became known as one of the distinguished Black writers of the Harlem Renaissance, despite the fact that she lived in Virginia. She became good friends with such luminaries as Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Langston Hughes, and her Lynchburg home at 1313 Pierce Street became a creative retreat and meeting place for the Black artistic community for over half a century. Artists like Du Bois and Hughes began staying with the Spencers while traveling because few Virginia hotels were open to Black Americans, and other notable names such as Gwendolyn Brooks and Maya Angelou often visited. She also became friends with such civil rights activists as Martin Luther King Jr. and opened her home for activism planning as well. In 1923, she became the librarian at an all-Black local high school known as the Paul Laurence Dunbar High School. The high school library at Dunbar also served as the only Lynchburg library branch open to Black Americans, and Spencer worked as librarian there for more than 20 years, building its collection by supplementing the library of initially only 3 books with books from her own home. She was Lynchburg's first Black American librarian and retired in 1945. During her lifetime, Spencer was able to publish over 30 poems in magazines and anthologies. She published many poems during the 1920s, with her work being notably featured in Alan Locke's famous anthology, The New Negro, An Interpretation. She was the first Black American woman to be published in the Norton Anthology of American Poetry for her writing, and was also published in such anthologies as The Book of American Negro Poetry and Caroling Dusk. Her work has attracted renewed attention in the 2010s and has been gathered posthumously in modern collections such as Time's Unfading Garden, Anne Spencer's Life and Poetry, Half My World, The Garden of Anne Spencer, and Lessons Learned from a Poet's Garden. She was also later featured in Shadowed Dreams, Women's Poetry of the Harlem Renaissance. In 2000, 2 of her poems were included in the Library of America's anthology of 20th century American poetry. Anne Spencer died at the age of 93 on July 27, 1975, and is buried alongside her husband, who died in 1964, in the family plot at Forest Hill Cemetery in Lynchburg. Still poetically active. That was a phrase that I saw, and I just love that phrase. Poetically active. Still poetically active up to her death in 1975, Anne Spencer wrote one of her most evocative poems titled for that same year, 1975. Her Lynchburg home was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1976 and is now a museum, the Anne Spencer House and Garden Museum. The Anne Spencer House and Garden Museum is also designated a Virginia Historic Landmark, a Friends of the Library USA Literary Landmark, and a Historic Landmark by the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. In 2016, the Library of Virginia and Dominion Power honored her as one of their strong men and women in Virginia history. Anne Spencer's papers and books from her personal library are located at the Albert and Shirley Small Special Collections Library at the University of Virginia. Some of her personal correspondence with James Weldon Johnson are also part of the James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection at the Rare Books and Manuscripts Library at Yale University. In 2019, the United States Postal Service announced that Spencer would be featured in a 2020 Forever stamp honoring figures of the Harlem Renaissance. And I do believe those stamps have been pushed back because of the pandemic, but I really hope they still come out with these Harlem Renaissance stamps. But that's Anne Spencer, a hidden figure. There will be more links and information in the description box on this woman. Really, just a magnificent, accomplished woman. And I love that, she didn't really get published for her poetry until she was 40 years old. There's always time. I don't know who needs to hear this right now, but there's always time. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. Like I already said, Anne Spencer, a hidden figure. Food for thought as always. See you guys tomorrow. Peace.